Chapter 29. A Child's Funeral. Blackie knew the routine and headed for McGoy's instinctively once Fitzsimon's hostelry had been passed. "A bottle of stout would only give me a thirst," was Clark's reaction as he pedalled past as if he had just got out of bed. "I'll have 2 pints drunk by the time you get into the village," he laughed as he put down the boot, a smile as big as the going in of Ballymahon on his finely chiselled face. "We'll be in as quick as you," the boys shouted after him as Grandad urged Blackie into a light gallop, bringing roars of approval from them. They were off the cart and into the grocery just seconds behind Clark. "Well, boys, how did it go today?" Ned asked. No bother at all today. It'll be harder tomorrow, though, when we have to catch the wet sods," Mikey replied. "Here, help yourself, lads," he said, holding out the big jar of sweets to them. They needed little convincing. Reaching into the jar, Mikey drew out a couple of Peggy's legs, asking if they could bring 1 or 2 home to little Anne and Paula. Poor Anne couldn't eat sweets because of her illness. It didn't stop her from smiling, though. She would chuckle away in her pram as soon as the boys appeared after being away all day. Paula minded her like a mother hen, and, like her 2 brothers, she was devastated when the angels came for the special one at an early age. "She's with her own," Father McCabe told him when he did the necessary before the child was placed in a white coffin and taken to the graveyard on the carrier of Rex's bike. Word spread like wildfire as the neighbours stood by their doors and gates, blessing themselves as the cycling cortege passed slowly by. Poor Beryl, overcome with grief, blessed herself and threw a fistful of holy water on the group, who quietly acknowledged her noble gesture. Death was never far from the door when proper medication was hard got. Nevertheless, the strongest survived as always, even if food had to be rationed due to the number of children clambering for a share. Unable to show their deep-felt emotion, men ran for their bikes in solidarity and joined in behind the now sizable group. Father McCabe stood waiting by the graveyard gate as the cyclists dismounted, propping their bikes by the roadside wall. It was only a matter of months since he had left Black Jack standing like a statue by the church gate for a scurrilous reference to the Pope and something else about magic. He was still standing there as people filed out of the church an hour later. "It'll be a gay while before he thinks of crossing Father Francis again," Scylla said to Biddy as she blessed herself. "And that's a fact, Scylla," Biddy replied. "I heard it said he questioned how the good priest saved Jesse's child, and it as blue as the sky above. He has the power, no doubt, and it'll be a brave man who'll say other." Séamus and Pat took the tiny coffin and walked silently to the plot prepared earlier by Peter Courtney and Pete Mullen. Laying a hand on Rex's shoulder, the saintly priest read the rosary and sprinkled holy water on the coffin before the grave diggers started their work. "The prayers are for us sinners," Father Francis said. "That child went straight to God, and we'll be looking after you all as long as you live. Nora will be fine, don't worry. Peamount is the right place for her, and she'll be well looked after there. You won't find until she's home with you and the kids." As the lads tapped the top of the tiny home, a tear ran down Rex's cheek. A hard man. He took no prisoners, but took nothing else either, unless it was by mutual consent. Thanking the good padre, who had long been a friend, he walked him to his car and tried to offer him a sealed envelope. "I suspect there's money in that, Michael, so keep it, as I've less need of it than yourself. Your needs are greater than mine. You have a woman to look after and kids to rear, so hang on to what you've got. Is there something else in it? There's a note from Nora. I didn't read it, as she wanted no one else but you to read it. Keep the money and give me the note, so. A ripple of conversation flowed as they parked their bikes along the railings before filing into Fitzy's bar. Although not much more than a shebeen, it was very popular and had just recently had electricity installed. Fitzy turned off the radio out of respect as Rex called for a drink for the closely knit group. Sure, you mightn't bother, Rex, was the usual reply when asked their preferences. A bottle of stout, so, if you please, meant good manners were adhered to, even if one was as poor as the next. God bless all here, brought them pivoting on their heels as the priest's soft voice broke over them. Jesus, you too, Father, Clark stuttered as the unusual sight of a priest in a pub, especially this one. Sorry, Father, I didn't mean to take his name in vain. He gasped as his unfortunate faux pas. He'll not be hard on you, Jim. Don't worry about a slip of the tongue. We're all human. I'll look after that, Mr. Fitz, he added as his gaze swept the room. And you might as well add another in the name of God on this sad day, he advised as he stood beside Rex. You'll have something yourself, Father, Fitzy queried in a reverential tone. I'll have a lemonade to take with me if you have the like. He knew only too well that his delicate stomach wouldn't be able for the bacteria attaching themselves to the edge of a glass half washed in a rinsing bucket. Though close by the river, the joys of running water had yet to flow in the old world shebeen. Your blessings will come quickly, Mike, he promised. I just popped in to wish you all well and to say the church is with you on this saddest of days. He was gone before anyone got their breaths back, leaving a bemused group and a fiver on the counter that would wet several whistles before the day's work was done. You put the two of them in it there, Clark, Rex said as he heard the Morris minor departing. How was I to know it was himself? Clark blushed at the thought of his taking the Lord's name in vain in front of his disciple on earth. Mind that money, Fitzy, Rex cautioned when he saw the two shadows slipping in by the back door. It's as sound as a bog, Sally, Rex. It'll do the job it was meant for, was his measured reply. A huge plate of ham and cheese sandwiches soon appeared on the beer-stained counter. That's for the mourners, Fitzy said as he fixed the two late entries with a knowing gaze. His right-hand man, Red Biddy, read the scene expertly as soon as she heard there was a crowd gathering. The Bush telegraph was primed to perfection and soon had her in the back kitchen preparing heaps of sandwiches. Give them a couple of bottles, Rex said as he saw the look on their faces. It's an ill wind that doesn't blow somebody some good, he nodded to the boys. Wish you, Rex, you're the best of the bunch, and my heart goes out to you, so it does, sniggered the Sleveen as he tested the waters for a worthwhile drink. Any man as loses a crater afore it walks is blessed be the man above. And what would you know about children, seeing you never had one? You're too miserable to keep anyone but yourself, Rex blasted back at him. Look at the cut of you. What happened to you anyway? It's easy for you to laugh, Rex. Weren't we on the bog all day? Looks like that, all right. Could you not tidy yourselves up a bit before you came in? With what? He asked. I hadn't time to go in to Brady Brown's, if you want to know. We don't have people sending us bags of stuff every day, and that's the holy all of it, he said as he tightened his torn overcoat across him. The reference to Mrs. McCormack didn't sit well with Rex. Well, I'll be off so if you don't mind. Didn't the nuns give you a heap of stuff not long ago? You needn't be putting on a show for me boyo. I know you only too well. If everyone had their own, you'd have less. Aye, and your crowd would have less too if you weren't involved with Brady and his gang, he threw back as he turned away. As he made to move, he felt an iron grip on his wrist. Don't start that fucking crack with me, Sleeveen, or you'll wake up with your ancestors. Don't be like that, Rex. I was only given as good as I got. But sure, I forgot the day that's in it, and God's truth, my heart goes out to yourself and your little woman. Ye have a pure angel looking after ye now, and maybe she'll be able to look after the likes of me too. Sure, wasn't I only going to tell you something about the crutch, but you mightn't be interested at all. Out with it, and stop beating around the bush like the rest of them. I'll tell you all about it, so, if you give me a drink. I have a fierce thirst in me after the bog. Fitzy caught the nod and put a pint bottle of Guinness in front of him. Blessings of God in your Rex, he said after taking a huge mouthful. I needed that better than me dinner. Wasn't I passing the way the other day when I saw the crutch hopping over the wall behind the abbey, and I said to myself, now what would a man like that be doing in there? As soon as I turned the corner, I hid me bike and hightailed it back so as I could see him without him seeing me. I hid down behind the old wall, and as sure as I'm here, didn't he disappear before me eyes with a bag or something? I had to hide it in the booltree bush in case he come out somewhere. You wouldn't believe that, but as quick as you'd bless yourself, didn't he pop up beyond the other side of the road with the bag still on his back? Now, there's only one way he could have done that, and that was to go underground. Now, there's something for you, Rex. A man keeping all that to himself, and he having more than enough as well. He shook his head as the thought of anyone doing the like. It was a good while after he was gone, because I was afeard he'd return, when I slipped into the abbey and spotted where he had been working and where he had covered over his tracks. It didn't take me long to clear away the stones, and there in front of me own eyes was a secret tunnel that we heard all about long ago but could never find. Well, I covered it back up as quickly as I could, but didn't spot this, which I think might be worth a bob or two. With that, he fished out what appeared to be a copper brooch that seemed to be fairly well preserved. He dropped that somehow, I imagine, he said, all the while keeping a weather eye on Rex. Would it be valuable, do you think? He asked, knowing Rex had more than a passing interest in the light. It might, mind you, but I'd like to see where the tunnel goes first. Not a word to a sinner until we have a good look around, or I'll be dug out of you. I'll be doing a few weeks' work fixing the window, and I'll have a look around if you're interested in dropping in by chance, he winked. Meanwhile, Fitzy read the situation perfectly, popping another bottle in front of the Sleeveen. Sound as a sally, so, Rex. Not another word to the world, so. Content he had looked after his business, he beckoned to Fitzy to settle his bill. All done, Rex, taken care of by the good priest himself. Better to have a friend in court than two in hell, as they say. Safe home now. I won't be long after you myself. As soon as I put the run on the stragglers, I'll hit the hay, for tomorrow is another day, and with a bit of luck, better than this one for both of us. Good night, all, he waved as he lowered his head going out the back door for fear of a late-night visit from the squad from Longford. It wouldn't do to have let the sergeant win his hard-earned collection now, he thought. For win, he'd have to let him, or he'd been in the worst of the world after robbing him in the shinny only a few months earlier. Give to God what's God, and the devil sweep the rest of them, he thought to himself as he threw his leg over the rally and headed for home. No sooner had he gone than Clark excused himself, seeing he had to go home or there'd be no milking done in Clohan. God help the poor cows so, said the monkey as he nearly fell off the high stool laughing. That affect a lot of you so. You'd think they'd milk themselves. Little did they know the monkey had been listening to the earlier conversation between Rex and the Sleeveen. Clever as a jailer, he slipped out without being spotted and headed across the graveyard to investigate the story. If he could only get his hand on the monk's long-lost treasure, he'd be set up for life. Though he never had much, He always had enough. His wizardry with the women and at the pitch and toss kept him in more than beer money. The luxury of a late-night visit to a parlour of pleasure was his one motivation. Proud of his prowess in this field of fancy, he rarely paid and never went hungry. Nevertheless, he made ends meet in his own inimitable fashion. Never a mean man, he knew his strength and depth was much appreciated by those who valued such attributes. Nor was he lost for female followers. Oft quoted, some said he linked to passion where mere mortals failed to follow. Though never verified, or so they say, he was said to have plunged deep into the facebank in the interests of science when times were hard or colours were flying. Divide of bacteria was his proclamation on being quizzed on the merits or demerits of the situation. God gives for good reason, he was wont to say when asked if he'd approve or disapprove. As Clark had left earlier in order to be home for the milking, it didn't occur to the monkey that he might have been on a similar mission. Forgetting that a new grave had just been dug for Maggie Cootie, Clark had fallen headlong into it. Try as he might, he couldn't get out of it, as it was over 6 foot deep. Bad cess to be Cootie in his big spade, he swore as he prepared himself for a final leap. Despair gripped his heart as his fingers clung to straws before giving way as he fell back with a thump into the darkness. Half Christian, half pagan, he resigned himself to Mother Nature and promptly fell asleep, dreaming of tunnels and dungeons that led to the strangest places. He found himself wandering from one labyrinth to another until he came to the junction that led under the Any to Burns's on the right and O'Connell's on the left. He decided on the left fork because of his fear of water. Then all hell broke loose. As with most bars and dens of iniquity, the secret became the prophet of all. Fitzy was up to speed by now, as the walls shared their secrets and the shadows spoke volumes. Years of babysitting the blind told him more than any oracle could. If he couldn't gain from it, then he'd be part of it, and so it was. The stragglers gathering around the front door felt the full force of Lucifer as shouting and roaring rose from deep within the graveyard. Such wailing as would raise the dead sprung from the depths. "Ah, suffering Jesus, it's the end of us all," cried the Slevene as he ran for his bike, only to fall headlong into the ditch with fright. Grabbing the pitchfork and the yard brush, Fitzy handed them to Seamie and Matty and leaped to the fore like a revolutionary of old. "Follow me, lads," he urged as they stepped over the low wall and into the cemetery. Fueled with false courage, the stragglers followed him at a respectful distance, each stepping back out of politeness to let one another follow Fitzy in an orderly fashion. Their false courage soon deserted them when they heard weeping and wailing that hadn't been heard since the Vikings put the monks to the sword. Suddenly, a vision of two savages appeared, shouting and roaring before them. Fitzy stood his ground, but the others took flight and would still be running were it not for a burst of laughter from the monkey and Clark. Realizing how comical the situation must have appeared, their sense of the absurd rose to the surface and took the fear out of the situation. Clark told them he was taking a short cut home when he fell into the open grave. Unable to get out of it, he lit a fag while considering his situation. There was nothing for it, he thought, only wait for the morning, which wasn't far away now either. Sitting back, he promptly fell asleep and would still be there were it not for the fact that the monkey fell in on top of him a short while later. Certain he had died and gone to hell, Clark made one final effort to elude old Nick, thinking it was he who had come for him. With one last desperate effort, he leaped onto the monkey and clean out of the grave. Scrambling to his feet, he was astonished to hear the monkey's voice coming up from below. Cold sober now, he realized the monkey had fallen into the same trap as himself, and it was he who was whimpering for old Nick not to take him this time. Promising to share the spoils if his soul was saved for longer, he cried like a banshee. Looking down at his terrified face, Trask burst into uncontrollable laughter before reaching down to pull his bewildered companion from the jaws of hell. As they stood together beside the Oakham stone, the hilarity of the situation gave rise to a thicker plot. In a few seconds they hatched a plan to give the lie to the truth. Deciding to play the banshee rather than admit their stupidity, they agreed on a more devious plan which would further their cause and keep the nosy from venturing near the tunnel until they had time to do so themselves. We were beyond in the old abbey when we saw strange lights coming from where the tunnel is supposed to be, and decided to dally over behind a wall where we wouldn't be seen, said Clark, and declared to John the Baptist, didn't the two hooded figures walk clean through the wall with sacks on their backs? Well, we took to our heels, and like two proper Egypts, didn't we miss our footing and fall back into Cootie's new grave? What they had to go and dig it there for is beyond me. Thinking it might be the safest place to be for a while, we hid in the shadow until we heard you coming, and nothing would do, Clark, only act a fool as usual. Well, I agreed too, I have to admit. No good pointing the finger when your own is stuck up your arse, he guffawed as the open-mouthed crew threatened to throw the two of them back in again for frightening the bejesus out of them. Pints of porter were being pulled by the new time as gangs of thirsty workers kept filtering in. You'd think there was going to be a drought or a strike above in James's Street, laughed young McGoy as he carted out a tray of porter for each table. Damn thirsty work, the master quipped as he watched aloof while pretending to be reading his newspaper. The boys were amused, knowing there'd be no hurry in the men that evening. Tomorrow is another day, and it could look after itself. Well, Clark, are you ready for it? Rex asked as he pointed to the empty glass and ordered Teddy to fill another. Recognized as the finest slainsman in the county when he was sober, there were few who'd keep into him even after a hard night of it. He was as natural with a slaying as a drover with a blackthorn on the way to the mart in Ballymahon. If he was born in Tip or Kilkenny, he'd have been some hurler, Tom Fitz said as he helped Teddy with the pints. Pete Ledwith was losing the rag playing patience in the corner, while Quigley was sitting over by the front window reading the Irish press and keeping one eye on everything as well. Few knew he had a glass eye, because it married so well with the good one, but he gave the game away in a fit one day and frightened the daylight out of all his charges. It was amazing how he managed to see so much, Pete Courtney remarked when he saw him picking up the change from the counter. Toss Mullins strolled in laconically just then, his waders around his knees, fly rod over his shoulder, and a brace of salmon sticking out from his satchel. Any luck? Asked Pete, pretending not to notice. Divil the much apart from these two, he replied, as if it was an everyday occurrence. I hooked a big one, but it went in under a tree at the aqueduct and snapped my line. I'll get him again, though. Not if he sees you first, Seamie piped up to roars of approval from the others. Young Seamie is cutting his teeth. We'll see how lively you'll be tomorrow after a few wet sods hits you in the kisser, he smirked as he pretended to enjoy his own joke, knowing full well he had been beaten to the punch. Out of the mouths of babes, Quigley quicked good-humouredly. It was lost on Tosto. Feckin' little know-all, he said as he went out to the lounge where some of the visitors might be more amenable. Which of you is going to get the water? Grandfather asked. I'll get it, Seamie volunteered as he jumped off his bike and got the big bucket. He could hear the others chatting as he crossed the stile into the field. Though he thought he knew exactly where the well was, he was unable to locate it. There was no well to be seen. He remembered his father and brother going over that stile and knew it had to be here somewhere. But where? Thinking they must have got the water from the stream, he filled the bucket, wrapping the plastic bag over the top and tied it securely before taking off after the others. It wasn't foolproof, but it would help to keep most of the water from spilling as he rode gingerly along the deeply rutted lane. Small groups were busy unloading bog barrows and tools, while others were tending fires or checking water channels, one of the most important aspects of safety, according to his grandfather. Everywhere he looked, he could see movement. People arriving on bikes, sitting high on iron-shod carts drawn by mules, horses and donkeys, with the odd Massey Ferguson chugging away here and there. The dry morning got them all out early, he thought to himself as he passed Jimmy Connell's garden. The little shopkeeper who went round the houses with his van full of groceries was feeding a few calves in the haggard along Aska Boring. Good husbandry by generations of his family had reclaimed soggy bogland into a fertile island where crops of potatoes, carrots and onions grew faster than on many a farm. His ability to cross seeds in the fertile bogland was already legendary and brought a steady stream of buyers for the lettuce and cabbage plants as well. "How's the young footballer?" he shouted as Seamie passed by, to which salutation the youngster responded warmly with, "Never better, Jimmy. I'll be pulling them out of the clouds shortly." "No doubt you will, Gossoon, no doubt you will, but don't take your eye off Clark for a minute or he'll leave scraws in your ear," he advised, knowing full well the tricks that particular gent got up to. "Don't worry, Jimmy. Tess warned me about his tricks. She also told me how to cod him too, so we might have a draw before the day is out." He laughed as he remounted carefully, not wishing to spill the precious bucket of water. The forest of ferns by the roadside were as tall as himself, thereby hiding many of the groups scattered across Askey Bog and beyond to Kiel Fear Ishkin, the fort of the clear water. Knowing grandfather would be curious as to who was early and who was late, he stood up on the pedals to get a better view. The Dolans, Cooties, Cahals, Mulveys, Mitchells, Butlers and Cahills were well ensconced by now, some even having campfires going in preparation for the first break and breakfast. Tea time at 10 meant everything to everybody on the bog. It meant a respite from the hard work, a chance to warm the hands from the sopping sods, as well as providing fuel for flagging energy in the early morning chill. For the young, it was a chance to walk and talk, and they were gone as soon as they had eaten a few hard-boiled eggs and a couple of heels of Macnamee's bread, their favourite. Meanwhile, back at the bog, the boys were keeping a close eye out for grandfather's next move. The moment he stood up, they were away, clearing drains like prize jumpers at a gymkhana. "Good lads, did you get all the news?" was his first question on their return. A long and difficult day's work to be done. The boys were back in harness in seconds. Their work was too important, too essential for one of the neighbours to hold another up. That could be done differently and in more cunning ways another time. But this work would lead to good storytelling on cold, wintry nights by the warm glow of the self-same sods. "Tom Mulvey had his shovel stolen last night," Mikey gushed. "It is hardly his own anyway," Rex laughed as he winked at Clark. Clark took up the cudgel then, with another rare one about the previous night when he was coming up the road from Maggie Taig's after a feed of rasp and a wink from Molly. "A nod is as good as a wink to a blind horse," Molly told Nora the following day as she shook her head at another missed opportunity. "And maybe you're better off. Sure, he'd only be slobbering on you after a feed of pints," she joked as she took a piping hot soda cake from the oven. "He wastes all his goodness on the fecking Guinness," she moaned as her sister laughed at her. "Did he ever shift a woman?" she asked, knowing the answer full well. "He was a boyo in his teens, but something happened that turned him off, replied Molly. I wonder would it have anything to do with any one of the Aoghains. It said he got a fierce beating after one of them left the country in an awful hurry. She got married to an older man beyond in England soon after, and little has been heard of her since, Nora half asked, half wondered. Sure, wouldn't half the parish be gone if every woman had to go, said Molly, as she thought of her own situation. There's more ways of killing a cat than drowning it in milk, she laughed heartily as she changed the subject. Clark warmed to his subject when he saw Nugget pretending not to hear him. I could have sworn it was Dolan I saw sneaking past Fitzsimons's with a shovel strapped to the bar of his bike. It wasn't his either, because I heard him asking Sam Ferrer earlier if he'd loan him one. Did he not give him one? Rex asked. He told him he hadn't one for himself, as he had already loaned the ones he had. The poor man is far too generous for his own good, Nugget pronounced as he spat on his hands and eased himself down the ladder into the bog hole. And wasn't I heading to Coal Hill after that when I spotted the same bike again under the widow's window, he said as he tossed a tempter up to Mikey. He bet you to it, laughed the Nugget as he slid a haymaker in Seamie's direction. Blessed with peripheral vision, he ducked, but spinning like a top, he side-smacked it onto the barrow, raising a triumphal fist as Grandad acknowledged his dexterity. Keep some of that for Sunday, Vic, he winked as he tossed a regular one. There's work to be done, lads, if we're to bottom this out before the midges come out for the dinner. Canuckanore, the Hill of Gold, as it was known, stood away across the heather near Williamstown. The day Dannon had mined for gold there before they were banished to the underworld, according to the Nugget, who knew more than his prayers, as Kate Carney once said of him when he inquired if she still had a longing for the buck. That's for me to know and you to find out, she laughed as she put a plate of rasp in front of him when he was on the run, and knew the last place they'd look for him would be under their own noses. They'd have a hard time finding him anyway, as a secret trapdoor led from the cellar to the fairy fort in Lisnacreeva, where even the bravest Brit wouldn't go. The whole area had a mystic sense and seemed lost in time as the crew eased into full throttle and sods came flying up from the two cutters below. It was a lovely place to be on a warm summer day, Seamie thought, but this was still spring, and the cold sods would soon have altered his optimistic outlook. Rex was in charge of the wheeling of the turf, and had Blackie strapped to the barrow when he arrived with the water. Micah was laying on the first few sods and turned to greet him. Grandfather saw his opportunity, winked at Clark, and let fly two sods in rapid succession. One sailed high over Micah's head, but the other caught him flush on the side of the jaw. If looks could kill, the two slainsmen were already dead in the bog hole. Dancing with rage as he brushed the slimy substance from his hair and face with the sleeve of his jacket, he glowed at his grandfather, who was roaring, laughing at the good of it. Keep your eye on the ball, Vic, he advised the hapless youth. What are you laughing at? He growled at his brother. Nothing. I was laughing at the ass, he answered, doing his best to try and keep from bursting out, which infuriated his brother even more, forcing Rex to step in to keep the peace. Fill the kettle there, Vic, he advised as they walked out the bank, to where a nice fire was glowing in a circle of stones. Blackie grazed contentedly as they filled the kettle and settled it neatly in the centre. As soon as that was sorted, he was off out the high bank, leaving Seamie attending to the fire and the making of the tea. She's ready, boys, brought proceedings to a timely halt as the slainsmen climbed out of the deepening bog hole. Though pushing 60, the Nugget was still able to keep in with Clark. Clever as a fox, he knew when he had enough and needed little persuasion when the shifts were changed. 2 hours constant was enough for any man, he advised. Change like the weather, and you get the best out of any man, he told Clark when he took a mug of tea from Seamie and a heel of bread that had feed half the parish. The eggs are done too, the young chef informed them as he transferred them into a plunger of cold water to cool them off. Have you no egg cups? Clark remarked dryly as he was given a handful of duck eggs. You wouldn't know what to do with them, Seamie replied with glee as his grandfather slapped his knee with delight. There was no hanging around after the impromptu breakfast. The laden skies were heavy with rain. It would only be a matter of time before they were routed from the bog. Leaving Seamie to tidy up, they got back to business and soon had sods flying as they got their second breath, keeping tipping it tidily back and forth across the kish to keep into them. Clark and Nugget were used to working together and soon had a good rhythm going. The two youngsters stood each side of the wooden barrow and took the sods as they flew off the slanes before layering them on as deftly as a stonemason. No sooner was the barrow full than Rex was gone out the spread bank, having left the empty one for the boys to fill. As usual, Blackie stepped sure-footedly out the soft bank and across the kish to the high bank where the barrow was flipped over as the animal turned quickly on the reins. Hour passed hour as the crew kept up a steady pace. A shout went up as the boys spotted their mother swinging in the road on her bike, a basket of goodies on the carrier and more in the front basket for the midday lunch. Couldn't be a minute sooner, Rex smiled as he relieved her of the bike and basket. I suppose it's the usual, Nora, he remarked as they walked in the high bank together. I'm not a magician, she answered sharply with a hint of a smile. Only kidding, girl, he joked as she made a half-hearted swipe at him. A quick wipe of his hands with a clump of wet moss took most of the bog dirt away and eased the Nugget's aching fingers. It was well known that turf held little of any bacteria and was often used with big moss as covering for a wound when nothing else was available. However, they all knew Nora wouldn't be happy with them handling food with dirty paws, so a quick visit to an adjoining bog hole sufficed to satisfy her strict hygiene rules. I heard the curlew calling as I came over the road, she said, to no one in particular. It wasn't lost on them, however. We'll have rain, so, Rex answered as he shot a glance at the sky. It wasn't long until they were knocking back mugs of tea with hunks of soda bread and a mixture of duck and hen eggs. Nora knew only too well how hard the work was and did her best to provide the food that would keep the energy levels up and the tempers down. That was no easy task either, because the nature of the work, the oft-times wet and dangerous conditions, the early morning cold, and the sheer drudgery of the hours of monotonous toil was enough to test the patience of Job. However, on a fine day, with a full belly and the crew revelling in the constant repartee, it was as close to a pleasure as one could expect to find under the circumstances. I mind the time my sister Agnes was crossing the fields in Knocka with a bit of grub for myself and the brother, the old man began. It was a heavenly day, with nature full of itself, and she came to the point where she used to cross Tess's river. As bad luck would have it, the two planks had been washed away by the recent flood, and there was nothing for it, only wade to the stream or jump. It wouldn't have been her first time either, but being well on the way, she had to think twice before risking the unborn. Hanging the basket on the end of a fallen branch, she stretched it safely across. Then, standing well back before taking a good run at it, she took flight. Despairingly, her fingers clutched at straws as her feet found soft ground, and with an anguished cry she fell backwards into the waist-deep water. She didn't say if she lit candles or not, but she hadn't much time for that either, because the child had enough of the waiting and decided now was as good a time as any to make an appearance. As fortune favours the brave, she coped with the situation as nature ordained, and, holding the newborn high, she waded through the stream to find a safe place to exit. Well, No better place than Tess's River for that either, because just then that little woman, being closer to nature than anyone, was making her way back from Knocker, and hearing the anguished cry and spotting her friend's dilemma, she hurried to pull mother and child from the fast-flowing river. Nothing would do her then but to accompany them and see them safely to where Mrs. Connell or Farrell would be only too delighted to look after the new arrival. Meanwhile, there was mother and child to attend to, so, needing no advice, they both stripped to the pelt. Being a soft day, they weren't unduly worried. Tess handed over her slip to wrap the child in as much as she could spare of her own clothes, so that both would have enough to preserve their modesty. As soon as they reached Knocker, they were hurried indoors to a blazing fire, where they were mollycoddled like chicks with a clocker. "Now there's the story for you," Grandad said, as he kept one eye on the heavens. "I wouldn't be a bit at all surprised," he grimaced, as he thought of the work to be done before the leaden clouds burst and left them running for shelter. "We'd better tear into it so," he advised, as he eased himself up and strolled into the little copse of sallies and elders that afforded shelter and privacy for one's necessities. "Get out, you fucker, you!" brought the crew to their feet, as Smullen burst from the shelter and out the bank as fast as his 2 legs could carry him. "And you cunt, you, if you know what's good for you," he shouted at the briar, who took off through the undergrowth like a young bull. "That's put the wind up on them," he remarked, as he joined the gang around the fire. Not knowing what had just taken place, they were agog with interest and began firing questions like Vincent Gill himself. "It's a strange old world, childer," he said, shaking his head. "Those 2 baskets should be locked up, as they're a danger to humanity. I caught them lying beyond in the clump of ferns. At it good they were. It's a pity I didn't have the spade with me, or I'd have hopped it on the hoors. Begging your pardon for the rough language, Nora." Saying he'd explain later, he finished another mug of tea before lowering himself down the makeshift steps and tearing into it like a man possessed. Clark had no option but to do likewise, knowing the nugget was not to be tangled with in this state. Up above, the boys were feeling sods by the new time, wondering what had gotten into everyone. Rex signalled that it would soon blow over, because his father couldn't keep up that kind of pace for long. He was right. "Put on the kettle, one of you, or I'll be dug out of this bog hole," he explained, as he wiped the sweat from his brow with the back of his hand. "Done," said Rex, as he flicked the reins and steered Blackie out to the high bank. He growled for an hour afterwards, as he was visibly shocked by his encounter in the bushes. "There's no place sacred any more, with the likes of these 2 feckles watching gossins like women," he confided later, as they were supping pints at the bar in McGeoy's. The rumble of thunder in the distance brought a sudden end to the day's endeavours. Loading up as fast as they could, there was no time wasted getting out of the bog. Forked lightning flashed around them as they darted into McGeoy's just as the heavens opened. With Blackie safely tethered in Rooney's shed, Rex came in after them as a fierce clap of thunder lifted the boys out of it. "That's nothing, lads," McGeoy laughed, as he handed them a couple of Peggy's legs and a macaroon bar as well. "Don't pay a blind bit of heed to it, lads. It'll be over in an hour and you'll get home dry," he predicted. The bar filled up rapidly as the storm forced everyone to shelter where they could. Most made it to one or other of the bars, depending on their usual custom. It wasn't long until the banter started, and the big story of the day brought a good card school around them. "I'll catch up on those 2 hours later," Rex promised, as he knew a couple of thumps would keep them well removed from the young lads. "It might and it mightn't," Clark cautioned, as he told them in confidence about the time they had accosted him and seemed to relish the beating he gave them. "2 perverts is what they are," he added. "And not the only ones around the parish either, I suppose you know," brought quizzical looks from those seated around. "Aye, there's a few more of their type around, but harmless enough compared to those 2 buttes," the buccolero added. The hare being well risen now, a few onlookers began to offer their tuppence worth in the hope of being let in on the game of stud. It was just what Nugget and Rex were angling for. The buckalero read the signs like a psychologist and stirred the pot like a well-trained apothecary. Grabbed their interest, sucked them in and cleaned them out. They laughed later as they counted their winnings at the crossroads before parting for the evening. Although it was well past tea time, Nora had everything ready as soon as she heard the iron-shod wheels coming up by the school. Blackie sensed home now and his feed of carrots. He wouldn't tolerate much of a delay, they knew, so leaving the old man dozing, they clicked the animal onwards. As good as any well-trained dog, Blackie broke into a light trot, keeping close to the hedge as he tipped along. A sight for sore eyes, Peter Castles told the brink later. As he was about to mount his high Nelly from the spudstone by the Bullfield gate, he heard the crew coming. Mounting quickly, he followed them home to Balnamanna, marvelling at what a well-trained animal could do. Margaret was waiting at the gate with the bunch of carrots when they arrived. "You need have no fear of that animal, ma'am. We wouldn't want to be waiting for the men to make it home on their own," she laughed as she helped the Nugget from the cart.